It's good to see all of you. When Nora asked me to take part in this class, I was delighted to do so because I think it's wonderful to have a class called Exploring Taiwan. I think that's very important, especially for international students. And when we debated about what I should talk about, I looked at your syllabus. I was one of the last ones that she signed up. And I saw a very good cross-section of topics about Taiwan, but none specifically devoted to the environmental situation here. Although I noticed Professor Joe Rue is going to come back toward the end of the term and talk about environmental education, which is an important subset of this issue. So that'll give some good balance to what I have to say today. As Professor Zhang said, I first came to Taiwan in 1969 as a PhD graduate student to work on my dissertation, so somehow I got hooked on Taiwan, right? And I've been coming back. Actually, this is my 26th trip to Taiwan in the past 40 years, so I come back almost every year, sometimes more than once a year. It's a very, from an intellectual viewpoint, I find Taiwan a very interesting laboratory. There's much to learn here, especially for a geographer, and especially for the environment. And that's what I want to share with you today. Let's see now if I can find the right buttons here. No, it's not working. Let me try one more. I'll get the teaching assistant here. The switch is not working. There we go. I'll master it. This is the title of the book that Professor Zhang and I just published last year. And he and I have been involved together since I first came here. We've known each other for 40 years. And so after several years of work, we came out with a book, first book in English, to look at Taiwan's environmental situation. And so I thought, well, this might be the useful thing to do today for you. I don't know how familiar you are with Taiwan's environmental issues, but I think everyone in Taiwan needs to understand what's going on here in the environmental realm. This is a very, very important topic here. So I'll share some thoughts with you today, and I've divided it in two parts, because I understand we have a 15-minute break in the middle of the period. The first part, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of some of the key issues in the environment, and then after the break, we'll come back and I'm going to talk about the high mountain country of Taiwan and some of the land use issues up there, particularly associated with the Cross-Island Highway, which Professor Zhang and I have studied intensively over, since the early 1980s. But let's start with this. If you want to measure a country's overall environmental status, especially compared to other countries of the world, one of the best places to start is here. It's called the Environmental Performance Index, EPI. If you're not familiar with it and would like to learn more, go to their website, www.yale.edu EPI. It was started by some scholars at Yale University. It's been done for several years now, and they measure, currently they have 149 countries. Obviously there's about 50 countries they haven't got data on, sufficient data on yet, but each year the number increases. And they measure each of these countries using 25 indicators in these 6 policy categories: environmental health, air quality, water resources, biodiversity and habitat, productive natural resources, climate change. And come up with a comparative ranking. 100 is a perfect score. 0 would be, of course, catastrophe. But they rank all of them as a way of comparing them. And this was the score for 2008, the last one they just did. And I included a few others besides Taiwan in red. Switzerland, not surprisingly, is number 1. Usually one of the European states is at the top. Norway, Switzerland, one of those very fortunate countries. Japan is typically always number 1 in Asia. usually has the highest ranking in Asia. Same way with the HDI, the Human Development Index, and other measures. I put the USA in for comparison. You can see we don't do too badly, 39 out of 149 countries. But notice Taiwan is neck and neck with the US, just almost at the same level, which is not too bad. So Taiwan's ranking in the world scene, 40 out of 149, is pretty good. You could be much worse off than you are today, and it was much worse off 20, 30 years ago. South Korea is a little bit further behind Taiwan, you see. Hong Kong is not included in this calculation because the people involved in this treat Hong Kong as, of course, part of the PRC, so they don't calculate it for it. I just put it in here to say my educated guess, having lived and taught in Hong Kong also for a number of times, would be to put Hong Kong below South Korea, but definitely well ahead of China. So it would be somewhere in here, and its ranking somewhere between 51 and 105, probably closer to that of South Korea than to that of China. China, the mainland, PRC, you can see it's pretty far down, 105 out of 149. So anyway, Taiwan doesn't do too badly, but there still is room for improvement, as I will explain to you in a few minutes here. Another measure, that just to give you a basis of international comparison, The Economist magazine, a very fine periodical, its intelligence unit does an annual ranking of the most livable cities in the world. The 2009 ranking, I just saw it recently, again on a scale of 0 to 100 as best. The 140 cities around the world are ranked using 30 qualitative and quantitative factors in 5 categories: stability, healthcare, culture and environment, education, and infrastructure. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, I don't recall hearing Professor Zhang mentioning this, but this PowerPoint presentation will go on the website, so you can access it later for details. So I saw some of you trying to frantically write down notes. I think you can get it later if you miss something, okay? That's Chicago, by the way, in a satellite image, in case you're wondering. But here is the ranking for 2009. Again, I just selected a few key cities in Asia, plus number 1, not big surprise, Vancouver, BC is always ranked as one of the most livable cities in the world. Tokyo, always ranked as the number 1 Asian city in livability. Hong Kong does quite well, though, you see, 39. Taipei, a little bit further back, isn't it? 62 out of 140. Getting toward the midpoint. It's not terrible, but it could be better, definitely. And then the cities of China, the big ones, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, you see. Just to give you a basis of comparison. All of the top 20, that would be 1 through 20 up here, except for Tokyo. But all of the others are in Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Interesting, none of the U.S. cities make it into the top 20 using those criteria. I found that interesting. I thought maybe one American city might squeeze through, but no. Sometimes Seattle, which is my hometown, gets into some of these very livable cities, or Portland, Oregon is another one that often does very well. Anyway, these are the influences on the environment in Taiwan. To some extent, this would be true in any country, of course. Obviously, geography is a critical factor, economy, politics, but ethnicity has a peculiar role for Taiwan because of the mix of population here. What about geography? Being a geographer, maybe I'll spend more time on this than others. You've had several lectures on Taiwan already. Some of this should not be news to you, but obviously a very mountainous topography with very steep slopes, youthful geology, a very unstable island geologically. You have frequent natural disasters, that's no surprise, typhoons, heavy rains, earthquakes, and you have a high population density. Let's look at those in a little bit more detail. Here's a satellite image of Taiwan. I presume, I know Professor Lin talked to you last week, did he not, I believe, about the topography of the island? Yeah, so you probably already know something about this, but a little repetition doesn't hurt. But Taiwan does have this unique character. of being an extremely mountainous, rugged island. There's not much level land. And you can see this huge mountainous upland area that dominates about 2/3 of the total island. And that creates special problems. Does this reproduce very well? Not terribly well on this particular. Yeah, it didn't come through very well in the reproduction, unfortunately, when you transfer it to a digital format. But what this shows essentially, it's from our book, one of the illustrations from our book, it shows there's really three stairs in Taiwan's topography. The plains, which take up almost a third, mostly the West Coast Plain and a few pieces over on the east. The middle slopeland zone from about 100 to 500 meters, that's another third. And then the high elevation slopeland, a little bit more, 39%. So a good chunk of the island is in that higher elevation slopeland zone, and that creates definite obstacles, as we'll see. So a few slides just to remind you of what I call the beauty and ruggedness of Taiwan's mountainous topography. I imagine Professor Lin, didn't he show you some slides last Friday too? Huh? Good. Amazingly, most outsiders before they come to Taiwan don't realize that it actually snows in Taiwan. But up in the high mountain country, the elevations are high enough, over 3,000 meters. In fact, there's more than 200 peaks that rise above 3,000 meters. This is one little geographic trivia point that I always like to remind my students when I teach a class on Taiwan. The fact that the highest mountains in Asia, east of Tibet, are found in Taiwan. Japan has none as high as, even Mount Fuji is not as high as the tallest peaks in Taiwan. It's amazing. I mean, most people just don't realize this. This little island, they can't imagine that it has such a unique mountain topography. And they're high enough, thus, in the wintertime to get snow. And there's a little fledgling skiing industry, even. Oh, yes, these slides really wash out, I'm sorry to say, in this projection system. But I'm trying to show you here a variety. These are all my slides that I've taken over the years. 40 years of slides on Taiwan, which I've donated to the department now. But these beautiful rugged mountains that, as I say, provide great physical beauty and recreation opportunities, but present real hazards to the people here. And another one. Lovely sunset picture heading down the mountains from the to the west coast. One of the images of the very interesting rock strata here. Geologists love Taiwan, geomorphologists, because it's a marvelous laboratory to study geomorphology and rocks and soils and erosion processes. But look at the steepness of those slopes, rising almost vertically out of the lower elevations. So, rugged topography. Very noticeable feature, very important feature. Water. Let's talk about water and its effects. Some key characteristics of water. Highly erosive in Taiwan, unevenly distributed, highly seasonal, easily polluted, and very difficult to clean up once it's dirty. Problem is, we can't live without it, can we? And this is another feature of Taiwan that is surprising to some first-time visitors, because Taiwan is a well-watered island. 2,500 millimeters annual precipitation, that's well above average. It ought to be enough water, yet there's not enough water. There's not enough water. Water shortages are an annual event here. One of the problems is it comes too much too soon. You've all heard of Morakot. I don't know if you were all here yet when Morakot struck or not, but I'm sure you've heard about Morakot. That came in August. This was shortly after I just got here, in fact, I remember. We were expecting it in Taipei, but it moved south, fortunately. Yeah, and it totally washes out here, but you can just barely see the outline of Taiwan up here. But the typhoon covered a huge, huge area. And I suspect all of you have seen this now famous photograph, haven't you? because after the typhoon struck, all my friends and relatives and colleagues back in the States saw this picture on TV countless times, and in the newspaper and in magazines. They said, "Oh, are you safe there in Taipei?" Yeah, they had no idea where this was in relationship to where we were up here in Taipei, and they said, "My God, the river washing away hotels and buildings like that. Now that's a real typhoon." This is unfortunately going to be one of the most remembered pictures about Taiwan for a long time. This is as the hotel is, this is in Taimali, down in the southeast in Taidu, as it's about to topple into the river. But these houses had already made it. Have you seen this one before, too? Quite an amazing demonstration, though, of the power of water in Taiwan. The intensity, the vast amounts of water that can fall in a short period of time. Highly erosive, highly erosive. Incidentally, this past week, Professor Lin, who just talked to you last week, showed me the latest 3D GIS imagery that he's gotten, showing the before and after pictures for Marcotte. And the devastation over in Taidung, for example, in the Taimali area, which was one of the hardest hit areas. It's just incredible. When you look at the before pictures, these slopes, I don't have it here, unfortunately, but the before pictures show these beautiful, heavily forested hills, not badly scarred with landslides, although landslides are common in Taiwan. But after Marcotte, as much as 50% of the forest cover in some of the worst hit areas was washed off of the slopes because of landslides and ended up in places like this. A really savage denudation of Taiwan's natural forest cover and soils. A very, very serious erosion problem that they encountered. But the rivers, of course, also create great beauty in Taiwan, in the mountains. This, I don't know if any of you recognize this or not, but this is in Taroko Gorge National Park, Taroko National Park in the eastern part of the island. Have any of you been to Taroko yet? Some of you? I hope, make that a must during your stay in Taiwan, however long you're here. Be sure you get over to Taroko, because it's one of the scenic wonders of Taiwan, one of the great natural wonders of Asia. I would argue probably Taiwan's top natural attraction. But the river runs through a natural marble formation and has carved a very steep, narrow valley through this area. And I took a picture from up above of some people clambering on the rocks below there. Waterfalls in the area like that. And here, the Japanese built a road through this area during their period here, and then it was expanded and improved after 1950 under the ROC. But there you can see this marble canyon and this very narrow river flowing through it. It's very, very beautiful. Absolute must to see. But it's also a demonstration of the ruggedness of the mountain landscape in Taiwan, particularly in the eastern part of the island, and the potential for erosion that is caused by that. And these are the mountains that rise literally out of the sea along parts of the east coast of the island. So do get over to the east coast. It's very different from the west coast and gives you an even more powerful impression or sense of Taiwan's physical beauty and weaknesses. Well, because of the system here, you can't see this, but right up here, just off the screen, unfortunately, is the famous Suao Hualien Highway, which for a long period of time, from the Japanese era onward, was the only way to get to Hualien on the east coast by land. Earthquakes are another part of the hazards, of course, and I don't need to say much about this. I think everyone knows about the last great earthquake they had here, the 921. You just say 921 to people, and they know Taiwanese, that is, know automatically what you're talking about, because it was an epical event, epical natural disaster that struck the island. And of course, in the urban areas, it results in a catastrophe like this, with buildings collapsing and serious loss of life. several thousand people killed in that earthquake. But up in the mountain country, it involves landslides and the cutting off of roads and destruction of villages and so on. So it's another powerful erosive force, in a way, in a manner of speaking. So Taiwan is essentially, could be described as a disaster hotspot. In fact, the World Bank in 2005 described Taiwan as one of the most vulnerable places on Earth for natural hazards. One of the most vulnerable, right up there at the top. Because here you have a rare combination of high rates of uplift, weak rocks, steep slopes, frequent earthquakes, and extreme rainfall events. That's a very bad combination. So one could describe Taiwan as a disaster. Compounding this is the history of development and settlement of the island in this volatile, very unstable, unsafe geographic environment. You have 23 million people, roughly, in a very small land area. But not only that, they're not distributed evenly over the island. This is a population density map, very badly showing on this slide, I'm sorry. But I think you get the sense. Heavily concentrated, most of the 23 million along the west coast here, and particularly now since Taiwan is a highly urbanized country, most people live in cities, so you have the major urban nodes of Kaohsiung, Tainan, the Taichung area, the Taipei, Taoyuan region up here, and just a few pockets on the east coast, Ilan, Hualien, and Taitung down here. So most of those people are on the west coast. Highly urbanized. Perhaps Taipei's 101 tower has now become the icon of modern urban Taipei and Taiwan. I'm not sure. People have mixed feelings about it, but definitely it is a symbol of an indication of the high degree of urbanization that exists on Taiwan. And with that concentration of most of the island's population in a few key urban nodes, that intensifies the environmental impact of people. What about the economy? The familiar transformation of Taiwan into one of the so-called Asian tigers, along with South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. Highly urbanized, as I said, more than 70% urban now. A very high mass consumption society. Taiwan is now 20th in the world, $31,000 per capita income. So, by all practical standards, Taiwan is described as a wealthy country, a fully developed country, or whatever label you want to use. It's up there with the European countries now, not far behind the United States. Our current per capita income is around 48,000, I believe. But when you have this kind of an environment, you have a large per capita output of wastes, solids, liquids, and gases, and intense land use competition with serious environmental consequences. And in that urban environment, Taiwan has built a massive infrastructure system, which you're probably already beginning to learn about, of railways, high-speed railways, different classes of railways, subways, freeways for the automobiles and buses and trucks. It's quite a sophisticated, very highly developed system, most of it concentrated along the west coast. But as we'll get into this in the second part after the break period, also including a number of critical cross-island roads that link up with new roads and railroads along the east coast. The east coast has been brought quite fully into the modern system of Taiwan in the last 10 to 20 years with these new railways and links around the south end and north end of the island. So the East Coast is no longer the isolated place it once was, which is both good and bad. What about politics? Politics always matters in the environment, in every country. Just to refresh your memory, in the offhand chance you're still not familiar with this, but it's very important to realize, 1945, of course, Taiwan was returned to the Republic of China government when the Japanese left. From 1945 to 87, we speak of that as the martial law era. when the KMT, the Kuomintang, ruled Taiwan as a single-party state. And then in 1987, that all came undone, and democratization arrived. Freedom of the press, human rights, everything took place very, very quickly. So from 1987 onward, we speak of that as the democratization era, or reform era, it's sometimes called. Give it whatever label you want. It's definitely been a very positive trend for Taiwan. But from an environmental viewpoint, there are very distinct differences between those two eras. And indeed, the link with the environment can be very loosely summarized in this way. During the martial law era, development in Taiwan, this is my expression here, I would describe it as development by decree, in the sense that the mainland, the KMT government running Taiwan under the ROC at that time, operated under this policy. Perhaps you've heard of it, recovery of the mainland. That was their overarching purpose for being here in Taiwan. Everything they were doing in Taiwan, ostensibly, was to build up Taiwan's economy and military so that eventually the Republic of China government could return to rule the mainland. The communists would be thrown out. It sounds silly to us today, but they firmly believed that, especially in the early decades of this era. And whether they believed it or not, it doesn't matter, because the policies they carried out were designed to enhance that goal, to achieve that goal. So that meant environmental issues were very low on the priority. Jobs, economic growth, military defense, these were the top priorities. The environment just had to wait. And if anybody didn't like that, public protests were not only useless, they could be dangerous. It was a time when you could get thrown into prison for doing the wrong thing. After 1987, the democratic era, I would describe it as development by environmental impact assessment, EIA. EIA is if you're not familiar with it, is a process, most countries have them now, where new development projects have to pass a review by some body, some unit, usually a group of experts, who evaluate whether that project will have a good or a bad impact on the environment. Do the benefits outweigh the costs, which is what you want, of course. And if the costs are too high, they will veto the project, and it cannot be carried out, theoretically. So in this era, the EIA era, you might say, although technically the EIA law did not get passed formally until 1994, but they were in the process of developing it right after 1987 through the 80s. Now, in this era, public protests are common, have been common. People mobilize and protest for a great variety of reasons. It's good in the sense that people are able to freely express their opinions and to protest, especially projects that are going to do harm to the environment, which is what you want. So a very, very different environment for environmental protection between the martial law era and the post-democratic era. Now, how does that all tie in with ethnicity? Again, if you're not familiar, you should be and become familiar with the unusual combination of population you have here. 2% Aborigines, the Yanjumin, the original inhabitants. They're true native Taiwanese, but they're only 2% of the population. The Taiwanese, the so-called Taiwanese, is basically a political term, meaning Han ethnic Chinese who migrated to Taiwan before 1945, and their descendants. And they're composed of two groups. The Holo, sometimes this is spelled Hoklo. These are from southern Fujian. They speak the Minnanhua, southern Min dialect from Fujian. They're 3/4 of the population of the island, so they're the dominant group by far. The Hakkas, about 12% Kejaran, the Keja people. But these two collectively are referred to as the so-called native Taiwanese, even though they're, strictly speaking, in chronology, they're not the original natives, but they're definitely the dominant group. And the language, the dialect of Taiwan is Taiwanese, that of the southern Fujian. Most Hakkas have learned Taiwanese in addition to their language simply to survive in Taiwan. And then you have the so-called mainlanders, and I put quotes around it because, again, this is just a political term to refer to the Han Chinese who migrated to Taiwan in that window of opportunity from 1945 until 1949 when the communists took over the mainland. And they're about 11% of the population, roughly. So, very unusual mix here, both in terms of ethnicity and politics. How does that tie in with the environment? You have two coalitions here. You cannot be unaware of this if you just read the paper daily. And indeed, I hope you all do read one of the daily papers. The Taipei Times is my favorite for English. Pretty good newspaper. But you have the Pan-Blue Coalition, run largely by the Kuomintang, but there's a minority party, the People First Party, that joins them. Mostly mainlanders, wealthier Taiwanese, most of the Aborigines. But their basic stance or position is pro-business, pro-China, and they have a record of being relatively weak on environmental issues. The Pan-Green Coalition, and that's their flag they would like to have, largely dominated by the Democratic Progressive Party, but the Taiwan Solidarity Union is a participant in this coalition as well. And their supporters, of course, are the native Taiwanese, especially the Holo. The Hakkas are mixed. About 20-30% of them support the Pan-Green. The others historically have supported the blue KMT faction. The Aborigines are also beginning to drift towards the Pan-Green, although they historically have been more Pan-Blue than Pan-Green. So it's primarily the native Taiwanese that dominate the Pan-Green coalition. Their stance is pro-business, anti-China, and much stronger in the environment. But you notice, though, I put question marks behind those two, because if you look at what has happened since 1987, and when Chen Shui-bian and the DPP were in power for 8 years, ostensibly their party charter calls for them to be very strongly for the environment, pro-green, anti-nuclear energy, etc., etc. But the reality of trying to run a country, to run the presidency and so on, resulted in many of their policies actually being diluted and waffling. That means backing down on some of their positions during the course of their leadership. So circumstances have often forced them to not be as supportive of the environment as possible. They're pro-business in the sense that, of course, they recognize the importance of economic growth. They're not anti-economic growth. They're not anti-jobs. But they believe in responsible business practices, environmentally responsible business practices. The environment has to be factored carefully into development decisions on new plants, new railroad lines or rail lines, new reservoirs, etc., etc., which environmentalists, of course, support. So it's a complex mix here, politically and ethnically, tied in with the economics. Just quickly, it's interesting to just make a quick comparison, though, of Taiwan with Hong Kong and the PRC, because I see some commonalities and uncommonalities, as I call it. All three of these three states, environmentalism arose out of private citizen NGO initiatives. That is the struggle between developers and environmentalists. It's the grassroots approach that has really been the engine driving the environmental movement in Taiwan, as well as in these other two states of Hong Kong and the PRC. All three states started environmental protection at about the same time. Taiwan's EPA was founded in 1987. In Hong Kong, the Environmental Protection Department started in 1986. In China, its National Environmental Protection Administration was set up in 1988. Interesting coincidence. That's true in many parts of Asia. The 1980s was an important period for the coming to fruition, or flowering, you might say, of environmental movements in a number of countries. So it wasn't just in Taiwan. All three states, I think it's safe to say that environmental officials generally are well educated and dedicated. The failings that have occurred in the environmental programs in these countries over the years, roughly 20 years now since the late 80s, whatever failings there have been largely, I would argue, because of the failure of the government leadership to back up their own environmental protection units. Public pressure forces them to establish these environmental protection units, like the EPA in Taiwan. But when push comes to shove, when the crunch comes, as we say in colloquial English, the highest levels of the government often have to back down and not support some of the environmental policies that their own officers have put together. Again, it's the realities of governing in highly fragmented, politically fragmented, polarized societies. And even in China, where you have a single-party state, there are deep political divisions that we don't have time to go into here, within the Communist Party and between the central leadership and local leadership that have prevented effective implementation of some of the national organizations' environmental policies. But I've given a whole lecture on that in a separate occasion. Here, some uncommonalities quickly. In Taiwan's favor, you have here a democracy with contending political parties and viewpoints that must reach agreement. In theory, not so easy to reach agreement, is it? And NGOs here thrive. Very active, vibrant, alive NGOs. I applaud the NGOs here. Some of them are very, very good and do very good things for society. In Hong Kong, you have what I would describe as a pseudo-democracy, autocracy, largely run by business tycoons in collaboration with the leadership appointed by Beijing. And the local government thus has to satisfy the PRC first, not the local citizenry of Hong Kong. NGOs have flourished there also, but they're much more constrained, in my opinion, than they are here in Taiwan. In China, of course, it's even worse. You have a single-party state. The Communist Party dominates. It's the ultimate authority. And NGOs, although they have been allowed to form in the recent years, you do have NGOs and environmental NGOs. They're much more constrained. Their hands are tied much more than is true even in Hong Kong, and definitely compared to Taiwan. The result is that I think that's reflected in the fact that Taiwan's EPI that we just looked at a few minutes ago is much higher than for Hong Kong and way, way higher than the PRC. So I'm a firm believer that if you look around the world at the environmental experience, there's a very direct correlation between environmental success and democracy. It's undeniable, in my opinion. Environmentalism in Taiwan, the role of the NGOs, quickly, just as one illustration, one of the best here, one of the strongest, is the Taiwan Environmental Protection Union, TEPU. Look up their website. They have a very good website, very interesting. It was founded in 1987. No coincidence of that year, you see, the year that democracy arrived. Over 1,000 members all over the island. It was founded really by academics. In fact, my colleague in this endeavor, Professor Zhang Qiangyi, was one of the founding members of TEPU. It has island-wide chapters. I speak of it as a shadow organization of the government's EPA, in that this is a non-governmental organization, but it has very much the same agenda that the government's EPA has. Cleaning up the air, water, etc., etc. They just go about it in a different way, from a bottom-up public mobilization perspective. They carry out campaigns, public education efforts. When necessary, they will organize public protests, particularly in regard to the nuclear energy issue. So they're very, very effective, in my opinion. But there are a number of them. There are many, many environmental NGOs in Taiwan. So, what are some of the environmental successes and deficiencies in Taiwan? This is a summary list here. I think the success stories so far are in nature conservation, reducing air pollution, and disposal of solid waste. Those are the areas where they've been the most successful. The deficiencies are a little bit longer list, of course: improving land use, meeting energy needs, controlling greenhouse gas emissions, meeting water quality needs, meeting water quantity needs, there's two different parts there, and disposal of toxic wastes. They've made progress in all of these, but I think we would have to still say after 20 years roughly, these are behind schedule, behind what certainly environmentalists would hope for Taiwan, but they're working on them. They're working on them. And overall, we saw Taiwan score. It hasn't done too badly comparatively with other nations of the world, but definitely there's still room for progress. I can tell you, having been coming to Taiwan, as I said earlier, 26 times over 40 years, I've been lucky to see the gradual progression in the environmental changes here. And Taiwan today is a vastly better place than it was in earlier times. Actually, the worst time wasn't when I first came. 1969, the pollution was just beginning to escalate then, you see. The worst time here, I don't think any of you are old enough to remember this, I don't believe, it was in the early 1980s. So that's what? How many years is that? About 30 years ago? Yeah? None of you are over 30, are you? Yeah. So, this is before your time. You didn't experience it here, but the air was really bad in Taipei in the first half of the 1980s especially, until the EPA got founded. I think that was sort of the bottom. But since then, the last 20 years especially, some very notable improvements, especially in those first three categories. Nature conservation, I beg your pardon. This is one of the great success stories of Taiwan, and I can applaud my colleague, Professor Zhang Changyi, because he's not here, but he has been instrumental in this very endeavor. He's been head of the national park system here in Taiwan, very active in developing and watching over the national parks. He plays a key role in that endeavor still today as an academic. But 20% of Taiwan's land area is now set aside in national parks, modeled much after the American national park system, which, by the way, is the model that most countries around the world have followed since our first national park, Yellowstone, was founded in 1872. That's become the model that almost all the countries of the world have followed. And we now have, I think it's 55 national parks in America. So this has been one of the good things America has contributed to the world. 6 national parks so far. They're talking about 2 more, but they have not made final decisions on those. 19 nature reserves, 17 wildlife refuges, 31 wildlife habitats, and 6 forest reserves. And these gradually change over time as they add more and so on. That again is a picture of the Taroko Gorge. Even better actually than the first one you saw, because you can actually see the road in one of the tunnels there. So this is a great thing. Have any of you gotten to any of the national parks yet? Perhaps you've gone to Yangmingshan, which is right up north of Taipei. That's the most urban national park we have, different than the others because it is so accessible to urban areas. But get to Taroko, go to Kending in the southern part of the island. We'll see Shueba up in the Central Mountains in the second half of the period here when I take you up there. But they're really fine places for recreation, particularly for a highly urbanized society like Taiwan. So that's a success. Air pollution is another one where they've achieved considerable success. And using a variety of measures. And again, these are more or less standard in most countries, of course. But they've worked. They work. We know how to clean up air pollution. This is actually one of the easiest environmental problems to fix. The technology is there, the policies that work are there. The only thing that is problematic in some places sometimes is politics. Getting the government authorities to implement them and enforce them, and the public to follow them and agree to them. Politics is the main problem, but the technology is easy. Cleaner gasoline, you remove lead and other bad polluting substances. You put catalytic converters on the cars. Taiwan has that, as does America. China's now starting to use those as well. In Taiwan, though, a unique feature, of course, is controlling motorcycles. You cannot be unaware of motorcycles here, can you? That's a very popular form of transport here, but they've modernized these to get rid of the more polluting kinds of motorcycles in recent years. And now you notice all of them, almost all of them now, are these small scooters, whatever you call them. I'm not a motorcycle rider, but they're very, very popular. You monitor vehicle emissions. You have to pass through these random spot checks of your vehicles, something we haven't tried in the United States yet, but checking the exhaust on an ad hoc basis without any advance warning, and if you don't pass, you can be fined and so on. And of course, vast improvements in public transport, getting people out of cars, first of all. Taipei's wonderful mass transit system, sometimes problematic, the Nehu line, right? Kaohsiung's having some problems with theirs, but again, you notice those aren't problems with the technology, they're problems with the politics, aren't they? That's the real issue there. And of course, traffic law enforcement. You have no idea how nice the streets of Taipei are now compared to when I first came here. In the early 80s, especially, as automobile ownership mushroomed, and there was almost no traffic enforcement whatsoever. It was chaotic, gridlock. You still have heavy traffic at times, I would agree, but I think it runs much more efficiently. You can actually get from one side of Taipei to the other in the same day now. It was awful, believe me. And I don't drive, but just getting there in a taxi or somebody's car was terrible. Much stricter emission standards for factories and construction. They monitor these now much more vigorously, you see. So air pollution has been brought down. I didn't bother to bring in a lot of dull statistics to bore you with. That's the deadliest stuff to show students, I find, are numbers. Do look at the EPA website if you want to see statistics, if you're interested in statistics. But the numbers don't lie. You can see the actual measurements. The air pollutants, the API, Air Pollution Index, is calculated. It measures a number of things in the air, including particles, and all of those categories are improving for Taiwan, and most importantly for the key urban areas where air pollution is normally worst. And even for poor Kaohsiung, which has a terrible reputation, as you know, for being such a dirty, polluted city, a reputation that I think is way overdue for changing. Actually, Kaohsiung is vastly better today than it was 20, 30 years ago. But the air there still is statistically dirtier than in Taipei because you have heavy industry down there. You have the steel industry, petrochemicals, and other things. And that's a bad combination, of course. It's harder to clean that up. But still, Kaohsiung is much improved. But Taipei, way improved. I've been struck in recent visits the last few years, coming in, and I could actually see the mountains. They were crystal clear. Something that would have been impossible back in the 80s. Even on a street of the city, you can actually breathe the air and it smells fresh. You're not breathing in diesel and other terrible odors. So big improvement. By the way, this is a map simply showing the many pollution monitoring, air pollution monitoring stations they have all over the island. So they monitor this daily and at different times of the day. So you can get very detailed statistical data for air pollution. It's still not finished. The air pollution can still come down. And by the way, just parenthetically, the API, you want to get it below 100. 100 and above is considered quite unhealthy. 50 and below is even better. 0 to 50 is pretty clean air. Taiwan's rankings, many days are below 50. You have a few days, Taipei, you have a few days of the year still, of course, when it's between 50 and 100. It's uncommon now for it to get above 100 here. So, and just by comparison, by the way, in Hong Kong. I just saw an article in the Taipei Times. Did you notice this about 2 days ago? A little short piece about Hong Kong's environment. Did you see that at all? They pointed out that this would have been last week. For a couple of days in Hong Kong, the API reached 174, which is the dirtiest air that Hong Kong has had since the year 2000. So they're still struggling with air pollution in Hong Kong. They're where Taipei was 20 years ago in their effort to clean up the air. Even worse in Beijing and Shanghai. There's some days in 2007 in Shanghai, they had a few occasions when the API reached 500. 500, can you imagine? Solid waste, success story number 3. Have you noticed how they get rid of garbage here? It's kind of complicated. You have to bag it in special bags and carry it to a site where the trucks pick it up if you're a householder. You wouldn't notice it if you're just a student living in the dorm and so on. But I live in an apartment building, so I know about this. I'll confess it's not as convenient as our American system where the truck comes to you. Here you have to go to the truck. But it works. It works. And it really cleans up the air. The garbage, I beg your pardon. The air too. But they operate on the principle of reduce, reuse, recycle. Food waste goes to rural areas in some cases for composting. Recyclables are collected. The remainder goes in these special plastic bags if you want them to pick it up. For incineration, they're in the process of ending all landfills. Incineration is generally regarded by environmentalists as the best way to dispose of solid waste. Properly run incinerators. And there's often a political problem with that. Some of the incinerators in Taiwan, they've been too close to population sources, and the waste ash has created troubles with neighbors in the area. But purely from a scientific viewpoint, if they're well operated, incinerators are by far the best way to get rid of solid waste, not landfills. And Taiwan is moving strongly in that direction. And one of the consequences of this new collection system, it's forced people to be more conservative in what they throw out. And so the volume of garbage has actually gone down significantly in the last several years. It's really quite amazing. I guess it's self-preservation. I don't know what the motive is, but because you have to take your garbage in these special bags, you buy these bags, carry them several blocks sometimes. I have to walk about a quarter mile from my apartment to where the truck picks up the garbage, believe it or not. So if I'm going to have to do that very often, I'm going to make sure I don't throw out anything unless it's necessary, right? I'm going to recycle as much as possible, and the remaining waste that has to be burned, food waste particularly, obviously, I'm going to try to minimize that as much as possible, and that's what most people have done. And so the total volume has come down dramatically. It's a success story. I think Taiwan's program in this is a model that many countries can follow. But they are deficiencies. I wouldn't call them failures. That'd be too strong a word, because failure means a total loss, right? But a deficiency means it hasn't quite reached expectations, original goals, perhaps not as fast as they'd hoped. So there's still a lot to be done. This is the one I want to talk about after the break. We'll take a break in about 15 minutes. Is that okay? Improving land use, especially in the mountain areas. And I want to talk about the National Land Recovery Act. This, by the way, is a not very clear photograph of the Cross Island Highway that was closed by the landslides in 2004. And is still closed to this day. We'll come back to that. Meeting energy needs. Well, this is a headache faces every single country in the world, but particularly the industrial countries. We're struggling with this in the United States. Those of you who are from America know this. This is Taiwan's 2000 energy supply. I just use this because it's the most recent one I have a figure for, or a diagram for. You can see more recent data in our book. But basically, Taiwan is trying to find the right mix of oil-based, coal, liquefied natural gas, nuclear power, hydropower. Every country struggles with finding the right mix of these in relation to their resources. and to protect the environment. And the bottom line is, no matter what mix you end up with, there's going to be some environmental impact. It's just the nature of society that we have to have energy. Energy pollutes, no matter where it comes from. So you try to minimize the pollution. That's the thing. And that's what this international debate going on right now about greenhouse gases is all about. Collectively, the world as a whole, trying to find the right mix, isn't it, of what we should use, what fuels should we use, how should we get our energy from, where should we get it from, what's the best way. Coal is so attractive, and there's so much coal. It's a pity, isn't it? We have coal, the whole world could run on the coal reserves we have and forget all the other energy sources, and we'd have all the energy we need. But, it's a big but, isn't it? You know what coal does. It's the worst emitter of greenhouse gases. You have the ash, the waste product afterwards to dispose of. And that can be very polluting because it has to be stored somewhere, and it's terrible. It's a difficult energy use a source to rely upon. Nuclear power, that everybody knows about the problems of nuclear power. So a real struggle. And Taiwan hasn't found the energy balance they need yet. Again, it's very much tied in with politics. The Pan Blue is strongly pro-nuclear. Pan Green ostensibly has been against nuclear power, for example, and wanting to promote renewable energy sources, but it's difficult. Controlling greenhouse gas emissions, then, is the other side of that. This is just a diagram to remind you of the greenhouse effect. I won't take time to go into that here. You can look at that on the website if you want to peruse that at your own leisure. But only 21 nations in the world exceed Taiwan in their greenhouse gas emissions. Isn't that interesting? You only have 23 million people here. It's a small nation, relatively, but you're a big producer of greenhouse gases because of your highly industrialized, highly urban, rich society. And so Taiwan is struggling with this, and your situation is compounded by the fact that you don't exist formally as a nation, and thus you're not a member of the United Nations. You're not allowed to participate in many of these organizations. You will not be at the meeting in Copenhagen unless are they going to allow you as a visitor? I can't even remember now. Yeah, that's right. That's right. You'll have a representative, but not officially as a country, as a nation. Yeah. To give Taiwan's government credit, under both the KMT and the DPP, they have been supportive of the Kyoto Protocol of '97, for example, and all the other measures that have come along, wanting to be as supportive as possible. And even though they're not officially recognized, they will play their role in whatever is agreed upon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here. And I applaud the governments and the political parties here for that position they've taken, a very responsible position. But it's not easy. Again, it comes back to just a minute ago, finding the right energy balance for Taiwan that will bring down greenhouse gas emissions. It's multifaceted, as you know. It means getting people out of cars more, as well as using more efficient public transportation, just using less energy totally, and that's not easy. Well, that reminds me, yesterday's issue of the Taipei Times had a delightful article, you might like to look at it, about an American couple that tried to go green. Did any of you see that? It was just delightful. They tried to be as environmentally conscious as possible and reduce their family greenhouse gas emissions drastically. That means they gave up their car, they even gave up public transportation, rode bicycles, they got rid of appliances, and did all sorts of really self-sacrificing things to minimize their individual family input into greenhouse gas emissions. And it makes for a delightful story. I think they're writing a book about it, I believe. You might like to look at that in yesterday's issue of the Taipei Times. If everybody did that, of course, it would produce wonderful results, but it's really not realistic. They did it as kind of not a stunt, but as just an experiment on their own. They're very environmentally conscious, and they wanted to try it. And I applaud them for it, but that's not realistic for society as a whole, I'm afraid. Water quantity needs. As we said at the start, you have this odd combination. A large amount of rainfall, yet demand exceeds supply because of uneven distribution of water over the island, extreme fluctuations in availability, it's highly seasonal, steep slopes and rapid runoff, and consumer water prices are way too low. Okay, water. First, quality. Big issue. I better move along here. 50 major rivers in Taiwan. The proportion heavily polluted actually has decreased. Here's a few numbers for you, sorry. From 2003, 15.8% to 4.7%. But moderate to lightly polluted proportion has increased slightly. So river pollution is still a problem here. From sewage and industrial effluents, runoff from agricultural chemicals, that sort of thing. They're struggling with this. It's very complicated, believe me. I'm sympathetic to their efforts in the EPA. But also, significantly, only 20% of households are served by public sewerage systems. They hope to get that up to 30% by 2015. Higher in Taipei, the two big urban areas, 60% in Taipei, Kaohsiung 40%. But I imagine, haven't you walked around Taipei on some of the streets and occasionally you get a whiff of raw sewage? Haven't you ever noticed that? Yeah. You can do right around Taipei, Taida here, the campus of NTU. Indication, of course, of underground sewage systems that haven't yet been modernized. You have raw sewage going in uncovered pipes, for example. So they have a big progress to make here still. And it's money, it's very expensive to tear up the ground, and especially streets, put in pipes. It takes time and a vast amount of money. It disrupts traffic. Very difficult financially, politically, in terms of the time component. So that's a big issue. Here's the water balance for Taiwan, just quickly. You can see it. 2,500 millimeters annual precipitation. See, most of that runs off. 78% comes in the wet season. I was talking about this. 90 billion metric tons is the total amount in volume, but during the wet season, all right? What is that number down there? 22% evaporates, 5% filters underground, 73% becomes surface water, but the majority of that flows straight into the sea, and for complex reasons, it can't really be accessed very much. That leaves only 14 billion metric tons remaining for human use in the current water balance, although actual annual use is 18 billion metric tons in Taiwan. So Taiwan's water supply currently is already exhausted, more than exhausted. That's why they have something like 50 plus water reservoirs all over the island of various sizes where they try to store water. But there are problems associated with that too. Here's the water balance. I won't, because we're short of time, I won't go over that. You can read that on your own. But here's water use each. Agriculture takes a whopping 71%. That is true in most countries, by the way. Agriculture is the main user of water. Households 19%, industry 9%. Here's a very important fact. Water bills account for only 1/2% of household income for Taiwan. The average is 3 to 4% worldwide. The average cost, a mere $10 Taipei per metric ton, and even less in Taipei. Thus, average water use in Taiwan is 284 liters per person per day. In Europe, it's only 170. To be fair, in the United States, it's higher than Taiwan's usage, but we waste everything in the United States. So, 25% of piped water, though, is lost through leaks. This is a big improvement they need. The system is old, and it's often poorly installed, and so there's a lot of waste of water. 20% of the water used is extracted from underground, much of that illegal, particularly in the agricultural sector in the southwest coast. So they need to raise water bills there, for, among other things, but they don't here in Taiwan because it's a politically explosive issue. But one of the consequences of pumping underground water is land subsidence. This is just a map showing there's some very severe areas along the southwest coast, down here and up in Ilan, where you've had subsidence over the years of several meters. The ground has literally sunk lower several meters because of the overpumping of underground water. In other words, the weight above it cannot be supported, so the ground literally gradually sinks and compresses. And that creates innumerable problems, as you can well imagine. And that's a big issue the EPA deals with. Fixing Taiwan's water supply. How do we fix this? Renovating existing reservoirs. No new reservoirs are going to be built. They need to repair the leaks in the system. They need to make better use of groundwater. Desalinating water, that is being experimented with, but they, in Taiwan's case, that's probably the least likely source of additional water. It's too expensive. You can only do that in the Middle East, where you have lots of abundant money. Recycling of water is one they're working very hard on. This is one that environmentalists particularly recommend. That is water that's used for industrial purposes, for washing and clothes washing, etc., that is not consumed directly by humans. That needs to be separated out from potable water that can be consumed by humans and used thus for irrigation and other uses where humans don't have to directly consume it. Instead of putting all wastewater together into purification plants and using very expensive purified water that's drinkable by humans for uses that don't require that level of quality, you see. The United States, some places in America are experimenting with this as well, trying to have two drainage systems, two sewer systems. One for drinking water, potable water, and one for all other uses. But again, that's expensive. You have to dig up the streets and everything again and put in extra pipes. We're doing that right, in fact, back in my hometown in Lansing, Michigan, right now. A green tax. This is one that we argue very strongly for. Charging full fare for water. Instead of only half of 1% of household income, charge the full fare for water, which would bring it up to, what, 3 or 4% maybe? This would provide increased revenues for environmental improvement. I think people would adjust to it if it's sold to them properly, if they're educated properly about the need for using water more frugally. People in Taiwan waste water. You all know that's human nature, isn't it? If something is cheap, really cheap, you're going to use it without thinking about it, aren't you? It's the nature of humans, of course. You don't value it as much. So if you make it more valuable, you will treat it better. You will take care of it and use it more frugally, more valuably. Disposal of toxic wastes, another deficiency. These are heavy metals, lead, mercury, toxic chemicals, nuclear waste, one of the most potent, of course. This is a very controversial and complex issue. I can't get into it here, we don't have time. But it could be described as a ticking time bomb. And I say, will Taiwan have its Minamata? Do you know what Minamata is? It's a place in Japan. If you're familiar with Japan's environmental movement, back in the 1960s, in Minamata, a place in Minamata, in Honshu, where, oh, go ahead. Yeah, I know, I've got to quit. Where lead poisoning got into the water, and it created some terrible environmental birth defects in people. And it was a national scandal, controversy. One hopes that doesn't happen in Taiwan. There's nothing wrong with that inherently, as long as you have the money to buy the imports and can obtain them elsewhere. Japan does this also. Many countries do. Even the United States, which is a huge producer of foods, we import a lot of food too. So there's nothing wrong with that inherently. In grain, of course, the United States is a huge surplus producer, a major exporter of grain. Japan, though, does even better than Taiwan in grain. There you're mainly talking about rice, of course. But also you have the fact that farmland in Taiwan has dwindled. This is the planted area, not land that is available for agriculture. But in 1980, you had 648,000 hectares. That dropped substantially to 470,000 in 2002. Do you know why? What happened? Why would it drop so substantially? Taiwan joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and that opened up Taiwan's doors to food imports, undercutting the prices that farmers here could obtain for rice and other things, and so they stopped planting. There was a rapid increase in the fallow land, the land not being used for agriculture. And it fell even more drastically to in 2004 to 230,000 hectares, 280,000 of that fallow. Population growth is currently stagnant at 23 million. That means you're at your current maximum possible population. There will never be more people in Taiwan than there are now, unless by some strange policy decision you open up the doors to immigration. As I like to tell audiences, I've talked about this before, I'm sure the mainland would be delighted to send you 1 million or 2 people if you would like them. They wouldn't miss them at all. 1 million, 2 million, how many do you want? I'm sure they would ask your government. But obviously there are serious, all kinds of problems with immigration. And I don't see immigration as a realistic solution to Taiwan's population. What's going to happen is you're going to follow in Japan's footsteps, and your population is going to start to decline. And by the end of this century, you will have significantly fewer people than you have now. You'll be below 23 million. And that has all kinds of implications for everything, doesn't it? For the economy, for jobs, for health care, and it's an aging population, so the demands of society are changing. For the environment, environmentalists, some environmentalists, regard this as a good thing because older people, first of all, consume less, so there'd be less waste produced. Their needs are different. They tend to be more environmentally conscious in general. So theoretically, fewer people, an older population could be good for the environment, but it has all kinds of serious ramifications for the economy, especially, and other things. This is just a graph for the world as a whole. This is a common problem in many parts of the world, in the developed countries. Aging populations, stagnant or declining populations. And Taiwan now is arriving at that stage of its development process.